In the year 2071, on a research station orbiting nothing in particular, a woman named Dr. Alin Voss stopped sleeping. It began the night she finished sequencing the 10,000th human genome in the archive, an unremarkable milestone, the kind that used to matter before machines did the counting. But this genome was different. It belonged to a child born in a village that no longer existed, in a country that had changed its name twice, and buried in her chromosomes was a pattern that should not have been there. Not a mutation, not an error, a message. Alin found it by accident, the way most impossible things are found. She was running a routine comparison, looking for the ordinary drift of ancestry, when a section of non-coding DNA lit up with an order too clean to be random. Junk DNA, they used to call it. The scraps left over from evolution's blind editing. Except this scrap repeated. Not once, not twice, but in every human genome she checked afterward, a shared, silent sentence written into the species itself, using a code that did not answer to any known dialect of biology. She almost dismissed it as noise, almost, but noise doesn't have grammar. For 6 months she told no one. She built her own translation matrix from scratch, borrowing techniques from cryptography and linguistics, cross-referencing the sequence against everything from solar wind patterns to prime number distributions to the shape of the sequence itself, which she realized on a sleepless night in March, folded into a structure that resembled, almost mockingly, the double helix that carried it. A code about the code, a message that described its own container. When she finally cracked the first line, she sat in the dark of her lab for 11 hours without moving. The sequence translated roughly to this: if you are reading this, you have become capable of reading this. It was not a threat. It was not a gift, not obviously. It was a door, and the fact that she had opened it meant the door had been waiting for someone like her the entire time, waiting across 4 billion years of cell division, across every extinction, every ice age, every war fought over land that would eventually erode into the sea. Alin brought her findings to exactly one person, Dr. Quaim Anselm, a geneticist who had spent his career being right about things too early and paying for it professionally. He listened to her for 11 minutes without speaking, which she would later say was the moment she trusted him completely, because anyone else would have interrupted after 30 seconds to tell her she was wrong. "Show me," he said instead. They worked together in secrecy that grew, week by week, into something closer to hiding. Not because they feared ridicule, though there was plenty of that waiting, they knew, but because the deeper they went into the sequence, the more they understood that what they were reading was not addressed to scientists. It was addressed to the species. And a species, they agreed without needing to say it aloud, does not get to choose when it receives a message meant for all of it. Someone had to choose for now. And for now, that someone was the two of them, hunched over borrowed equipment in a converted storage room, feeding line after line of ancient genetic text into a machine that had never been designed to translate anything but proteins. The second line took 4 months. It read, "You were not made, you were sent." Quaim remembers laughing when he first understood it, not from humor but from the specific vertigo of a mind trying to hold a fact too large for the room it's in. Sent by whom, sent from where, sent for what purpose, the sequence didn't say, not yet, and the not yet became its own kind of torment. They were reading a letter written across a length of time so vast that its authors had to assume nothing about their reader except that the reader would eventually exist, would eventually be curious enough, patient enough, and strange enough to look at the 4 billion base pairs of their own body and ask, why does some of this do nothing? Because it wasn't doing nothing. It had been doing this, waiting the entire time. They discovered, working late into a year that blurred into itself, that the sequence was not a static message but a layered one. Each generation of humanity, in a sense, had been unknowingly running a very slow computation every time a cell divided, every time DNA replicated with its small, constant rate of copying errors. The message was designed to be redundant precisely so that errors could not erase it. Thousands of backup copies scattered through the genome, self-correcting the way a body corrects a cut. It had survived plagues. It had survived radiation. It had survived being carried unread through the bloodlines of people who never knew they were couriers. Aline began to understand with a kind of vertiginous humility that she was not discovering something new. She was the 4 billionth and somethingth link in a chain of custody, and the only thing she had done to deserve the discovery was ask an honest question at the right piece of technology. The third line, when it came, changed the shape of the room they worked in. It read, "You are not the first message bearers, you will not be the last, but you may be the first to choose what happens next." Quaim wanted to stop there, not out of fear exactly, though there was fear, but out of something closer to reverence. He argued that some doors, once opened all the way, cannot be closed, and that the two of them alone in a room had no right to decide the manner of humanity's opening. Lynn agreed with him and kept working anyway because she had come to believe and told him so plainly that stopping was itself a decision, and probably the worse one. A species that finds a locked door in its own body and chooses not to look inside is not being cautious, it's flinching. So they pressed on, and the sequence, as if it had been waiting for exactly this argument to resolve, opened further. What they found in the deepest layer was not an instruction. It was not a warning, not in the way disaster films had trained audiences to expect. It was, instead, something closer to an inheritance with conditions attached. Whatever had embedded the code into the earliest ancestors of terrestrial life had done so not to control the outcome, but to leave behind a kind of proof. Proof that life once seeded tends toward complexity, tends toward curiosity, tends, given enough time and enough patience, toward the capacity to look inward and find the handwriting of someone else. The code contained no commands. It contained instead coordinates not of a place but of a frequency, a pattern of signal that, if broadcast correctly, would announce not conquest or arrival but simply confirmation. Someone read the letter, someone is home. Lynn asked the obvious question aloud. The one that had been circling since line 1. Why bury a message in DNA instead of carving it into stone, into the moon, into something that wouldn't require 4 billion years of blind biological trial and error to eventually stumble into readability? Quaim answered before she'd finished the thought, because stone erodes, moons get bombarded, civilizations die and take their monuments with them, but life copies itself. Life insists on its own continuation with a stubbornness no rock has ever managed. If you want a message to survive geological time, you don't write it on the outside of a species. You write it into the species. They sat with that for a long time before either of them spoke again. What followed was not the triumphant unveiling either of them might once have imagined, back when this was still an abstraction, still a puzzle rather than a responsibility balanced on two sets of shoulders. Instead, it was slow, careful. They brought in a third person, then a fifth, then a council of 12 drawn from a dozen countries and disciplines, sworn first to secrecy and then, deliberately, to transparency, because the two of them had agreed, after long nights of disagreement, that a message meant for a species could not remain the property of the two people who happened to find it first. The world, when it learned, and it learned slowly in careful stages, translated not just linguistically but emotionally so that the news arrived less like a shockwave and more like a tide, did not end. It did not erupt into the chaos that 100 old stories had promised it would. It argued as it always does. It doubted as it always does. Governments postured. Religions absorbed the discovery, each in their own idiom, some calling it confirmation, some calling it heresy, most calling it, eventually, simply true, in the quiet way that facts become true regardless of what anyone wanted from them. And slowly, across years rather than days, humanity began the work the message had, in its own oblique way, invited, the work of deciding together whether to answer. Lynn did not live to see the broadcast go out. She died an old woman in a bed by a window, having spent the last decades of her life doing the unglamorous work of translation, review, and public explanation, arguing patiently over and over with people who wanted the discovery to mean more or less than it did. She was, by her own insistence, not a prophet. She was a reader. She had found a letter in the dark and had the good fortune or the stubbornness to finish reading it. Quame outlived her by 11 years, long enough to stand, an old man now himself, leaning on a cane he refused to be photographed with, in the crowd gathered at the signal station the day the response finally left Earth. Not a message of pleading, not a message of triumph. Just the frequency the ancient code had specified, translated finally into something a dish the size of a small mountain could throw at the sky. Someone read the letter, someone is home. No one alive that day expected an answer in their lifetime. The nearest plausible origin point for the original code, by the best estimates of 100 converging disciplines, was tens of thousands of light years distant, meaning any reply, if a reply came at all, would arrive long after every person present had become themselves a kind of message. Information encoded in memory, in record, in the slow chemical persistence of ash and stone. But that had never been the point, not really. The point, Quame said in the last interview he gave before his own death, was smaller and larger at once. The point was that a species which spends its entire existence wondering whether it is alone had finally found, folded into its own cells, proof that wondering was not the same as being right. Someone had cared enough once to leave a door. And a species that finds a door owes it to itself, at minimum, to knock. Whether anyone answers is not a story that belongs to us. It belongs to whoever is reading someday on the other end, reading their own version of a message folded patiently into their own quiet cells, waiting the way ours waited, for someone curious enough to ask why some of the code does nothing. It was never doing nothing.